Hi everyone, I'm Lyla. I'm a Google developer advocate for Android, and today I'm going to be talking about instant apps and modularization. Okay, so I started off by wanting to have some sort of summary slide, and I made a sort of pictographic summary slide. So, we're going to start off with in the installed app world where we probably have a single app module. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you would make your first instant app by dividing out what you have into 3 modules. A little closer? Okay. All right, and then we're going to talk about how you actually separate out different features, and we'll talk about all about what a feature is to make a multi-feature instant app module. And finally, if there's time, we're going to talk a little bit about how you'd go about shrinking those features down. Okay, but before I dive into that, it's fairly important that you actually know what instant apps are. So I'm going to go through this kind of fast. Hopefully you've heard of them before, but they are basically miniature apps that give you a native Android experience but require no installation. And what better way to see what one is than by watching a little video. So I made this yesterday. Basically, the idea is that a friend might send you a link. You click on that link. You are immediately transported into an instant app experience, which is a fully native Android app. And this is the BuzzFeed Tasty Instant app. Cool. Next slide. Okay. Instant apps are supported on Lollipop Plus, which means that if you have a phone right now running L+, you could go into it, search for the New York Times. Hopefully, you'll get a Google search that looks a little bit like this. If you scroll down past the ads, you should see the ads that are, anyways. You'll see that there is a little, card there that you can click on that is labeled Instant, and that will open up an instant app experience for you. Okay, so instant apps are supported on more than 5 million devices. And on our documentation site, so instant apps were introduced publicly for everybody to be able to make one at I/O 2017. And on our documentation site, we have sort of links to case studies with different partners that talk about sort of the benefits and improvements that they got from implementing an instant app. Okay, so that's instant apps. I'll talk a little bit about the setup for one and just go over some of the key things that you'll need to do before you dive into the actual modularizing for an instant app. So the first is that you need to implement M runtime permissions. And this is important because the whole point of the instant app experience is that it's a very frictionless experience. So when the user clicks on a link, you don't want to immediately assault them with I'm asking you for all these permissions. Therefore, the permission structure for instant apps is M runtime permissions. Also, as you might have guessed from the fact that you are clicking or pressing links and opening up something, you need to implement app links. Now, app links have been out since API version 23, and there are a number of steps that you have to take to get those set up. But the basic gist of it is that you are associating a website or web domain that you own with your app, and that'll open up different activities in your app. So I'm not going to go through how to do all of that, but I do want to point out that in Android Studio, there's something called the App Links Assistant, which makes this a lot easier by kind of making all the boilerplate code and stuff for you. So one of the things that you need to do is set up intent filters for your different activities, and the App Links Assistant will make those different intent filters for you. It'll also set up or generate for you a JSON file that you then need to upload to your website domain to prove that you actually own that domain. Okay, so if you're using the App Link Assistant, it'll generate something like this for you. You can say here's the activity that I want to launch, and here's the URL that I want to associate with it. One thing to note is if you're implementing instant apps, you have to make sure to manually add this auto-verify true tag to it. This is important for the actual verification process to occur properly and instant apps to be accessible for your app auto. Okay, so I've mentioned both M permissions and app links, which are associated with API version 23, but Instant Apps work back to API 21 for phones that are running that. So how does that work? Well, there's actually an Instant App runtime that's been created, which emulates things like popping up the permission window and app links back to 21 specifically for Instant Apps. And if you go on a phone that's running L, you'll actually be able to see that there's this Google Play services for Instant Apps running on the phone, and that's the runtime. Okay, so there's other requirements that I haven't mentioned, but there's various security concerns and things that you'll want to deal with, considering that your user is having a sort of fundamentally new experience and clicking on a link and going into the app without explicitly installing it. So there are things like the fact that we want you to use HTTPS instead of HTTP for any of your outgoing network connections. If you're doing login, you should be using smart lock and other kind of requirements. There's also a limited set of permissions that are available to you. So these are definitely things that you should look into and be aware of before you, so that you can assess whether, what parts of your app might work well as an instant app. So anyways, for all those, a very handy link is this link to the Instant Apps kind of overall documentation page, and then you can go to the preparing your app page to see what all those requirements are. Okay, so that was my little bit about setup. So basically app links and permissions are the two big things. Now I want to talk a little bit more about modularizing. So the whole premise of Instant Apps is relies on this idea that apps are a collection of features. And why that's important is because when your user clicks on their friend sends them a link and they click on that link, they get this kind of splash screen that shows up while the app is loading. And it's very important for you that splash screen doesn't take, 20 seconds before they get into your app experience. Otherwise, that kind of destroys the frictionless nature of what's going on. Okay, so meanwhile, you are probably starting and are used to this idea that you have a single app that is existing within a module, and it's sort of a monolithic app. And you are probably using some libraries, but in general, all of your own code is living within this one single module. And if you create a new application in Android Studio, this is what it's going to default give you. But what I want to challenge you to think of your app as is a collection of features. So I have this kind of hypothetical restaurant app here that I'll talk through. So what are features? Well, they're discrete experiences that a user could have. And they are usually tied to activities. And for Instant Apps, we want them to be tied to activities because activities via app links are kind of the entry point into each of these Instant Apps. And with these features, the user should be accomplishing some sort of task that will give them some satisfaction from being able to have accomplished. So an example of a feature might be, if you have a maybe Yelp-style restaurant app, is looking at the information for one restaurant on the app. The user does that, they get some information, they're happy about it. Alternatively, another feature might be a flow where they're making a review for that restaurant. And you might have another whole section of the app which is about ordering items from that restaurant. So these are each distinct features. Also, most likely, your app has some common or base code that is shared between all these features, which I'm just going to put in this little purple circle called base, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But base code and resources refers to things like styles. Like, if you divide your app up into different features, you probably all want them to look the same still. So that code is all referencing the same styles and maybe an app logo. You're probably using shared utility classes between those, and etc. Okay, so going back to clicking on a link and quickly getting into this enjoyable native experience, one of the things that we ask ourselves when, or that sort of Instant Apps answers, is if the user is only using one feature, why are they downloading the entire app? Another way to think about Instant Apps is that you click on a link, you're downloading just the code needed for a single feature, and then the user is immediately able to use it. Okay, so a quick thing that I want to jump into, which might be crossing your mind, is that for instant apps, you do not have to fork your code. The whole point is that this is all happening on the same code base. So you shouldn't be thinking about like, okay, I'm going to have another like mini version of my app. That's not how this works. And it's actually important, besides the ability for you to not have to be dealing with two different code bases, to also give a very similar experience. Like the instant app shouldn't feel like a different app to users. And they should be able to seamlessly get from the instant app into the installed app if they decide to then go install it. So the way that this is achieved is that you take your big monolithic installed app and you separate it out into different feature modules. And you make a module for every feature. And then in addition, okay, so just by doing that, that enables us to have one code base for both of these different types of apps. So in addition, you'll make two additional modules called the installed module and the instant module, which are responsible for building your app in these two sort of different ways. So let's take a look at how the installed module works. So when you decide to build your app with the installed module, it's doing something that it should seem fairly familiar at this point. It makes an APK for you. You can upload that APK to Google Play. Then when a user decides to go and download your app, they'll go download it, and on their device, they will get that same APK. And remember, even if they're only using it for looking at information for one restaurant and they never even use the order feature, they get the whole app as that single APK. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what is happening in the instant app world. So when you build via the instant app module, what it does, okay, so this actually looks fairly similar to what there was before, but you'll notice that there are slightly different file endings to the ends of all of this. So the instant app module actually generates a zip file of mini APKs associated with each of your feature modules. And it is this packaged zip file that you upload to Google Play. And then the user's experience is that they click on that link to, go check out, their friend goes, hey, like, want to go eat at this restaurant? They click on the link, and it only downloads the detail APK for, the detail page about that restaurant. And then it's also going to download those base utility features and other code and resources that you needed, okay? But it downloads this bundle, and it doesn't download the other features. Okay, then later, if the user decides, okay, so let's say they go eat at the restaurant, they're like, hey, I want to give a really good review for that delicious pizza that I just ate. They might do a Google search or, navigate to a different part of the app. And then only sort of on demand does that additional code for the review feature get downloaded. So you're getting these kind of like bite-sized APKs coming down for you as needed as your user is going to different features. Okay, so let's see how this actually, or like what this actually looks like in code. Okay, so I am from a Udacity background, which is an educational website, and so my app of choice when I'm trying out new things is the Sunshine app, which some of you in this room might be familiar with. So the Sunshine app is a weather app, and it's pretty simple because it only has 2 screens in it. This is pretty easy to conceptualize as 2 different features. I have one feature, which is my future forecast of what weather I have to look forward to, and then I have another feature which is just showing me detailed information about one of the day's worth of weather. And potentially, if I'm like a weather Moogle and I run a weather company, maybe I would want to make an instant app because I'm noticing that most of my users are just looking at, they only care about the weather for today, and they're only looking at, weather information for a single day. All right, so the end goal is to have these 5 different modules. But this is what I currently have. So I'm going to get to kind of a halfway point, and then I'll divide it out into those 5 different modules. And the halfway point is to just get my first instant app up and running. And to do that, I will make 2 additional modules off the bat. So I'm going to be starting for my first instant app experience and my playing around with this. I'm just going to have 3 modules: the app module that I started with, and then an instant and installed module. And again, installed builds the installed app, and the instant app module builds an instant app. Okay, so when you make modules, they have build Gradle files or build.gradle files associated with them. And you putting configurations in the build.gradle file is how all this magic comes together and works. So we're going to take a look at each of those. The first one I'm going to look at is a settings.gradle file, which honestly doesn't change around a huge amount. So when you just had your installed app, it goes, hey, I'm including my installed app. And then when you add 2 additional modules, you'll also be including those 2 additional modules. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on in the Gradle file of the installed app. So each of these different Gradle files are differentiated in the way that they build by the Gradle plugin that's associated with them. So the installed app is going to be using the application Gradle plugin that you should hopefully be familiar with. Same old, same old. The purpose of this is to create your installed app. Thing of note, this is sort of the source of truth for your app ID. It's important that your app ID is the same for your installed app as your instant app, and your app ID lives here. And your application module is going to depend on everything except the instant app module, because it doesn't need to include an instant app within it. Okay, and you kind of have a choice here. You could have the application module have app code inside it that's specific to the installed app, or when I was doing these things, I preferred for it just to be empty and like its only purpose be to make the installed app. Okay, so this is not super exciting because this is probably stuff that you've seen before, but I'm using the application plugin. Again, you can see that my application ID is there, and then I have that one dependency on my app code. Okay, so I made a little dependency there. I'm going to go over to the instant app module. So the instant app module is where things get a little bit different. So now I'm using a completely different plugin called the instant app plugin. And it's the instant app plugin which is what enables me to create a zip of all of these different features that I include within it. So the instant app is going to depend on any of your sub-feature modules that you want to be part of the instant app. And you don't have to make every single feature within your app part of the instant app if you don't want to, but you can. Okay, and one of the things that was a little bit confusing for me when I started off was I thought that this module was going to have a lot of instant app related code in it, and it actually contains almost nothing. There's no code, no resources, and there's pretty much a blank manifest in it. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's take a look at what the actual Gradle looks like. So here is the, I'm applying the instant app plugin. And it's just depending on the feature that I want in my instant app, which is the single feature I have right now called app. Okay, and finally we'll take a look at what's going on in this app Gradle file. So the app Gradle file is going to now change from being an installed app to what we call an installed module to what we call a feature module. And the feature module is also introducing a new type of plugin. So the feature module is pretty cool in that it compiles differently based on what's consuming it. So when your installed app module is directing the build process, the features act as if they are Android libraries. But when your instant app module is directing the build process, your feature modules act as if they are compiled to mini APKs. So your feature modules in themselves are going to contain all the code that are specific to the feature. Oh, sorry. And I'll get into some other interesting things about that when we get to a more complicated scenario. Okay, so what does the Gradle file look like? Well, this is the old Gradle file. We can see that we had, I had an application plugin because, again, this was like the monolithic installed app. My application ID was there, and I had all sorts of dependencies. And I just switched that around, so now I'm going to be using the feature plugin. In a instant app where I only have one feature, I need to set this attribute base feature to true, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, in my dependencies block, I have pretty much all the same dependencies, but I have an added special application dependency that's referring back to my installed app. And this is the way that my feature, which you can see no longer has the app ID in it, gets to know what the app ID is. Okay, so there's that kind of loose dependency there, but it's not my, none of my features are ever going to be calling code from my installed app module. Okay, and then I have instant sunshine. So at this point, like I could open my app as a instant app experience and kind of see how it runs. And that did not take me a very long time to do. Okay, but that also kind of like skirts around the whole purpose of this, which is to actually divide up my code. So again, here's my end goal. And here's this sort of Mickey Mouse face looking diagram. But anyways, so this right here is just showing that like my large app has features in it and base code in it. So essentially what I did was I started pulling out one feature at a time. And by the time that I pulled out the detail feature and the list feature, then everything that was left in my original app code was the shared resources between the two. And I just renamed that to base. And then I was here at my divided up app. Oh. Okay, so a quick call out to something that else that I've been talking about and learning more about myself. So one of the reasons that this took me like less than a day. But one of the reasons that it was so easy to do that was because I had previously spent many weeks implementing a architecture based off of the guidance from the Android architecture components. And Android architecture components are a new group of libraries that are supposed to make it so that you have to write less boilerplate code and they get rid of some tricky edge cases. But they also have documentation associated with them about how one might want to architect an app, which I pulled a diagram from there. Okay, so shout out to something else. If you're interested in learning more about that, this is sort of the base page for the architecture components. Okay, so the other thing that was helpful was I used the Refactor Modularize tool. So to use this tool, you go ahead and you first make a new feature for yourself. So like I'm starting with my big app that has everything in it, and then I go and I make a new feature called like list. Okay. And then in Android Studio, I go and I select the different activities that I want to move over to the list feature. Then I can do a right click, refactor, modularize. I select the feature I select the module that I want it to go into, the feature module that I want it to go to. And now you could click refactor, but my expert advice to you is to click the preview button instead. And then you are going to get a list of sort of all of the dependencies that those activities have on other classes and resources in your app. And you can go through and you can go, hey, I want to move this dependency over with it. I don't want to move this dependency over with it. And after you're done doing that, you can say, okay, move them over. One thing to note is that the tool doesn't work with Kotlin yet, but they're working on that. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to note was that, I talked with the person who was working on this tool. So in general, we want to encourage developers who are interested in doing this to break their apps up into modules and create different features, which leads to things like updates in the Gradle plugin that make it easier to make build speeds faster when you're compiling modules. Another thing is this Modularize tool. So you should totally try it out. And if there are specific feature requests that you have, or you want to see some sort of visualization or something, you should get in contact with the team because they're kind of actively working on it and they want to make tools that can enable you to do this process faster. Okay, so that was sort of how I did the division there. So now I have this base module, which is a little bit different. So the idea of the base module comes from the fact that your features probably have overlapping code and resources, as I've mentioned before. But it's not using any kind of different plugin. It is using the same feature plugin. Okay, for the base module, there could only be one, no more, no less. And I think the name base feature is a little bit of a misnomer because, again, it's kind of like shared utilities and resources. It's not really a feature in and of itself. Okay, so another thing to note is that all of your other features must depend on the base feature. And the cool thing about having things in the base feature is that it only gets downloaded once. So you download your first, sort of bundle part of the instant app, the base feature gets downloaded. Then as you are downloading features. In addition to that, you've already downloaded, maybe the support lib if that's included in your base feature. And it's also responsible for propagating the correct app ID to the rest of your instant app modules. Okay, let's take a look at what's going on here. So it is just a feature module. So that's what that base feature true attribute means. That's signaling that this is the one feature in my app that is going to be the base feature. So if you have a single feature instant app, it will, by that one feature, will need to be the base feature. But otherwise, you will include this kind of like common shared base feature. And then it's going to have these sort of different looking dependencies. It's going to have that application dependency that I talked about before, which is what's getting the ID from your installed app. And it's going to have the feature dependencies, which is what's then allowing it to give that ID to your other feature APKs. Okay, and then just taking a quick look into what a normal feature looks like. Again, it's using the feature plugin, and it has to implement the base feature. In addition, it can implement any libraries that are specific to that single feature that you have. Okay, so that's kind of how the dependencies go. We have our installed and our instant app, which are kind of referring to all of the different features. Again, the instant app can selectively refer to features if you're not implementing them all as parts of the instant app. Then you have your actual feature modules that must depend on the base feature. And finally, you have your base feature, of which there's only one, and which includes shared code and resources. And then again, that base feature is propagating stuff back. So that's kind of what my app looked like. Okay, so another important feature of instant apps, going back to this kind of very informative graphic that I have here, is that we want our feature modules to be small. In development, we don't put any restrictions on you. You can make feature modules as large as you want, and this makes it easy if you want to just get going and separate out your code into a feature and kind of see what it feels like when you open it up. You can do that quickly. But when your instant apps are out in the world, again, you don't want this experience where the user's downloading a huge amount of code and it's like hanging on this this splash screen, and they are upset about it. So there's a hard cap that the amount of information that's coming down to your phone when you click on that link has to be 4 megabytes. Okay. And this should not be seen as like, okay, good, I get a whole 4 megabytes. It should be like, I want to make it as absolutely small as possible. And if I'm nearing that 4 megabyte bit, it's like, it's not a good thing. So don't try to make them 4 megabytes. Try to make them as small as possible, because again, the smaller your instant apps are, the faster that experience is going to be, and the less friction your users are going to have getting into your instant app. Okay, and the way that you figure out how big you can make things is that you look at the size of your base feature module APK and the APK from your whatever feature that you are trying to make less than 4 megabytes. So the math basically works out to, if your base feature is kind of big and it's 3 megabytes large, then every other feature in your app can be up to 1 megabyte in size. Again, you're trying to optimize for making things as small as you possibly can. If your base feature, though, is shrunk to having only 2 megabytes worth of shared libraries and code and whatever else you might have, then your specific feature modules can grow to be a little bit larger. And as a side note, the Play Store has a development track where you can sort of upload some stuff and get it working with 10 megabyte limit, but you're still going to need to get it under that 4 megabyte when it actually goes out into the world. Okay, so if you're wondering how you actually see how you're doing, let me take you through the steps. So the first thing that I want to say, and I felt kind of silly after discovering it, is if you are just playing around on your local machine, don't use the APKs that are emitted from pressing the green run button, because the chooser diagram or the chooser dialog pops up and lets you pick a specific device that you want to send it to. And it's optimized to just be including the resources that are needed for that device, so you actually don't get an accurate size for your APKs if you do that. So build it through the command line or use the Gradle console window. Okay, and then go ahead and switch over to project view instead of Android view, and you can navigate down through your build outputs, and you can see that instant app zip file that was created for you. And when you double click on it, it takes you into this wonderful tool, which hopefully most of you are familiar with, called the APK Analyzer. And the APK Analyzer is going to be your go-to tool for figuring out how big you currently are, and then also as you try to make improvements, seeing how much you're shrinking as you go. And you're going to want to be looking at that raw file size number. So that equation before, where it was base feature plus whatever feature that you're trying to minimize, you will look at that like 1.9 megabytes for the base feature, and then like the weather detail feature here is, I mean, they're both like 19 kilobytes large, so you add those two together. Most of the apps are probably going to see their largest file size numbers in their classes.dex file, which is all of the code that's actually used to run your app and all the library associations and that kind of stuff. And then the res folder has all of your images and other resources. And those are probably going to be the two largest things in your app. So if you double click on the dex file, you'll get a readout of sort of the different sizes of your own code and also libraries that you've included in your app. The size there is sort of the uncompressed version, whereas the APK actually compresses it a little bit more. So it's not the actual number, because as you can see, like the support lib is larger than my whole app is, which doesn't make any sense. But so what this is showing here is an uncompressed number, so you can kind of get the relative sizes of your different libraries, but don't use that as like the exact number. Okay, so originally this talk had a lot more slides on it, which were going into app shrinking. But I wanted to get to another topic, which I'll hopefully be able to hit. So I'm going to go over instead some handy resources that you can go to and a couple of instant app specific shrinking things. The first one is over on the Android developer blog. There's a great blog post that's specific about shrinking down your feature modules, and it has a lot of tips in there. The next is at I/O 2017, there was this really great talk called Best Practices to Slim Down Your App Size. And they take the Topeka app and basically take it from almost 4 megabytes to less than a megabyte. And they go through the different tools that they use to be able to do that. And you can see kind of some of them listed out there. One thing to say is that when I was working with this, resource shrinking for multi-feature modules was a little bit, it's not working yet. So a helpful, but one of the big things that resource shrinking does is get rid of resources that you're not using at all, and you might as well just delete those from the app. So if you're hunting for resources that you are not using, a very helpful tool is the find unused resources lint check. So you can just run the command line, the keyboard shortcut, type in unused resources, and open that up. Okay, another thing is ProGuard. So ProGuard is a best practice for minimizing your code, obfuscating your code, and just generally shrinking your app size down. If you are endeavoring to use ProGuard on your instant app, which you probably should first get it working on your installed app. And my colleague, Wojtek, posted this really great article about getting started with ProGuard fairly recently. So if you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out. It goes through both how to get things set up and then what to do when you start hitting, well, hopefully you won't hit compile time and runtime errors. But if you do, there are great tips in here to go through and resolve those. On instant apps, there's currently a feature with multi-feature builds. So there's a workaround posted there in the bug, and the team is working on it. Okay, another thing that I found really useful as I was shrinking things down was to use the compare with previous APK functionality that the APK Analyzer has. So I had this folder off on the side where I was saving, kind of time-stamped older APKs and doing comparisons to see if I was actually shrinking things down or getting regressions as I was doing these different steps. Okay, and just a plug for ProGuard. When I did the workaround that I linked to and ran ProGuard on Sunshine, it lost over 600 kilobytes, which in a world where you're trying to get everything to be 4 megabytes or less is a pretty significant thing. And that was in the base module too, so I got the savings, everywhere. The APK Analyzer also has the ability to load ProGuard mappings. So just as a small shout out, if you are looking at an APK that has been ProGuarded and therefore has obfuscated file names in it, you can now load those mappings in. convert your images to WebP. We have a tool for that. Go ahead and select your PNG images, and you can use the Convert to WebP tool to make those smaller. And at I/O, we introduced downloadable fonts. This is a link to a great dev bite that Florida made, which goes over kind of the basics of fonts in Android. But the basic gist of it is, if you're including fonts in your app, you can actually now have them downloaded instead, and there's some font caching going on with other apps that are on the device so that a font only needs to be downloaded once. So go ahead, if fonts are part of your bloat, you can check that out. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to get through as much of this part as I can. Okay, so one of the things that I was thinking about as I was going through this is it'd be really great if in some very specific situations I was able to have slight variations between what was going on in my instant app and my installed app. For example, if you read through some of our partner blog posts, one of the things that one of the blog posts says is that what they managed to do was in the instant app, they were using the Picasso library, which is a much smaller like image downloading library. And then in the installed app, they were using the Fresco library, which is like larger than a meg. And they were able to get that sort of differentiation. So I tried to do some research into how one would be able to go about and do that. Okay, but the big message, which the engineering team made sure to tell me to tell you guys, is that the point of this, though, is that you're not forking your code base. So this should be used minimally and in cases where it makes sense. For example, a case where it might make sense is if you are in the instant app, you might want to add a little button that says install. This doesn't make a huge amount of sense in the installed app, so it's probably something that you're only going to want in your instant app. For simple situations like this, there's Instant Apps SDK, which you can go ahead and then use functions from. Two of the cooler functions or more helpful functions are the isInstant app function, which tells you kind of what context that you're running in, and the show install prompt function, which gives you a handy dandy install prompt. So for button clicks where you would be going into a feature that's not currently part of the instant app, you can have a conditional where you're like, okay, show them an install dialog instead. Okay, so what about that slightly different library or slightly different resources example? For that, you can take advantage of Gradle flavors. So Gradle flavors have been around for a long time, and one of the sort of generic examples you'll be given is you might use Gradle flavors if you want to create both a free version of your app and a paid version of your app. So what I was trying to do is see if I could use Gradle flavors to create a version of my app that had a specific library that it was using and had specific resources, had a specific library that it was using, and another Gradle flavor that had specific resources bundled with it. The idea being that I wanted to create a version of the app which, if it was in the instant app version, would have Picasso with it and would be downloading images on the fly. And if I was in the installed app version, I'd just bundle up all those nice big image resources with it. So I made, I wanted to create a images included variant and a Picasso variant. Names, I could probably work on naming these a little bit better, but that's what I decided to name those. Okay, so going back to my Sunshine app, I did all of this in the base feature. So the first thing I did is I wanted those two different flavors. So you set up flavors how you normally would. I went into my base feature to set up the flavors. You're going to need a flavor dimension, which is basically the category that the flavor is. So the category of these flavors were my image downloading strategy. And then you define the two different types of flavors. So I had one flavor where I wanted to use Picasso and another flavor that I wanted to have a bunch of resources included in it. Okay, so got my flavors. All right, so for the so actually when you create flavors, you get these sort of different folder structures. So you have your main folder structure, which just shows you kind of what the both apps are going to get, and then you can make two different sort of parallel folder structures off to the side, where you can include the resources that are only going to be in the included class, or the resources that are only going to be in the Picasso flavor. So I went into my included flavor and I put in all of those large image resources that I wanted. And then for the Picasso flavor, I wanted the Picasso library. So in Gradle, again in my base file, I told it basically, if you are in the Picasso flavor, please go grab Picasso for me. Okay, so that kind of set things up. And then I created a interface in the main version of this. And with the idea that each of the flavors was going to have their own separate implementation of that interface. So that interface had like a generic sort of load image method. And then I made two different classes that actually implemented that interface in the two different flavors. And those classes need to be named exactly the same thing, and they need to just exist in those two flavors. And as you build each one of those flavors, that will determine which of those two classes is being used. Okay, so then I had different implementations, of course, in each of those. So one of them was grabbing the images locally, and another one of them was using the Picasso code. Finally, in the base class, I just had this like image manager class, of which there was a line of code which would generate. There's a line of code which would have a class that was based off of the interface, but then as I compiled to the different flavors, would get the flavor implementation that I wanted. And then basically all of my other features just called into this image manager class. Okay, so another thing to work out with flavors is that the idea with having an installed app and having a paid flavor and a free flavor is that it's actually going to generate that paid flavor and that free flavor for your installed app, for any app style that you build. But in my case, for my installed app, I only want to generate the version that has the resources included. I don't want to generate the version that was like made for the instant app. So you can use this missing dimension strategy line in your default config to be able to say, hey, I only want you to generate the included flavor here. Cool. All right, so some final thoughts. You should be thinking of your apps as a collection of features. If you want to get started with InstApp, maybe just get started making those two, the installed app feature and the InstApp feature, and hooking all that together. Then you can kind of go, you can make sort of strategic choices about which one of your features might work best as an instant app and work on extracting those from the app. The APK analyzer is probably your go-to tool for checking out what's going on and making sure that your features are less than 4 megabytes. You should be using ProGuard and other best practices, as anyone will tell you. And then if you're trying to get those little variations, the Instant App SDK, again, has that is Instant App method, and then you can also leverage flavors. Okay, so these are basically the links that I've given throughout the slide deck. The first one is the link to the overall Instant App page. Then I also have a link here that goes to samples. There's a bunch of samples of various complexity that you can look at when you're trying to do different things with Instant Apps. And also the code lab probably will take you less than an hour, and it'll get you refactoring your first app into an Instant App. That's the architecture components page, ProGuard page, and then that last blog post about managing your download size. There's also a bunch of other really good related talks out there that these are all happen to be from Googlers, but that were given. So the first two up there are basically the intro talks to Instant Apps given at I/O. Best practices to slim down your app size is the one that I mentioned, where they took an app from 4 megabytes to 1. And probably the most recent one was Modularizing your app, which was delivered at GDD Europe. All right, thank you.